Death in the Police Canteen. Inspector Renz Fox. First standalone episode about the retired police inspector who loved his job so much that he can't stop. By Ben Floor. Adapted from the successful Dutch ebook series. Renz's retirement party. It was Friday afternoon, and the Dutch weather forecast was grim. In hindsight, you could have seen it as an omen. The sun was still shining when an exhausted Inspector Renz Fox left the countryside of Zeeland for the busy city of Amsterdam. It felt pleasantly warm in the car, despite the time of year. It had started to rain as Renz was getting closer to the Kleinpolderplein near Rotterdam, and that rain had turned into sleet when he finally got out of the car in Amsterdam. It was one of those unpredictable days with fickle weather. Renz hadn't had much to do that morning. He had been feeling a bit sluggish, and the muscles in his upper legs had been aching. Last night's sleep had not been great, and boredom had struck him mercilessly. He had trudged into the bathroom in his pajamas to stare at his reflection in the mirror. The bags under his eyes annoyed him, as did the belly he couldn't hide under his police uniform anymore. He had washed, shaved, and combed his thinning gray hair before getting dressed. His wife March buttoned up his shirt as though she was tending to a child. She smiled, and smothered his muttering by tightening the knot of his tie. Renz had already loosened the knot half a minute later, but he had to tighten it again once they arrived in Amsterdam. "You look handsome tonight, Renz. Just right for an occasion like this." "Perhaps." Renz had navigated through a darkening Amsterdam and parked the car behind the Hema store, near the office on the Lanastraat. He got out of the car and straight into a puddle of rotting autumn leaves, prompting him to start complaining again. "I told you so. I should be wearing a proper jacket and boots this time of year, rather than a suit." "You really need to stop now," replied his 10 years younger wife March, balancing on her high heels. Those weren't everyday shoes for her either. As an artist, Marge usually wore overalls at the easel in her art studio. "This is supposed to be a celebration," she said. Renz had other thoughts about that. Renz and March made their way across the street and around parked cars until they reached the police station, about 100 yards further up. Renz had enjoyed entering this building every working day for more than 40 years, more so than for this so-called celebration. He had loved his job. It was hard to say goodbye. One handshake from his colleagues would have been enough for him. He entered the familiar hallway, which was empty apart from Sergeant Van Belzen. The sergeant had been Renz's would-be successor, overruled by the chief of police Van Stee by appointing Inspector Monroe instead. Van Belzen was waiting for Renz and March. "Hello, pensioner, we have a surprise for you." Renz wanted to reply but was interrupted by a push in his back from Administrator de Bucelaar, who hastily squeezed himself through the door behind Renz and March. "Nasty weather out there." The little bald man took his wet winter coat off. Renz did the same. Van Belzen politely took Renz's jacket and smiled when he saw the fancy gray suit. "Can I visit the ladies' room before we go in?" March asked. She returned with glossy, combed hair and fresh lipstick. Van Belzen proceeded to lead his guests through the building with his waddling, duck-like walk, which Sergeant Taylor could imitate so aptly. They passed the reception desk, made their way through the office with desks covered in paperwork, and approached the bare double doors that could use a lick of paint. For the last time, Renz turned his attention to the portrait of King Willem Alexander, which had replaced that of Queen Beatrix not long ago. Van Belzen opened the door and pushed Renz into the canteen, where he was greeted by a modest applause. A colleague called out, "Surprise." Not really, Renz thought. He had received an invitation with the signatures of his colleagues a few weeks ago. Renz looked around the canteen. The plain tables with white formica tops and worn edges were joined in a long row. Yellow checkered tablecloths provided a bit of color and did their best to create a cheerful atmosphere. Plates and cutlery had been laid out on the tables in front of each metal chair with a wooden back. Large glasses of red wine waited next to each plate, anticipating the toast. Almost all chairs were taken. His colleagues had arrived a bit earlier. Some of them were wearing their uniforms, and a few had brought their partners along. Everyone was sitting down, except for the chief of police Van Stee, who was stood at the head of the table with his cap under his arm. He pointed invitingly at two empty seats next to him. His colleagues started to sing their specially made version of Andre Hayes's Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He couldn't quite understand the lyrics sung by so many untrained voices, but he could distinguish the words farewell and retired repeatedly. Renz laughed and automatically loosened his tie again. Van Belzen pulled March's chair out for her. She looked beautiful, confident, and elegant, with well-maintained blonde hair down to the straps of her tight black dress, which went down to her knees. Yes, Renz loved her. Once Renz was seated and listening to all sorts of humorous and comical wishes for his future, Renz started to feel at ease. Will you go fishing now, Renz? Den Boer shouted across the table. Baudelaire, who was sat at the end of the table, answered, There's no way he's going to have time for that. He has to go shopping with his wife now, right, Renz? All of his colleagues gathered at the same table. If anything, that was nice after all. Chief of Police Van Stee, who had traveled from Haarlem for this occasion, tapped his glass with the back of a fork. His uniform and cap added an official touch to the gathering. The voices slowly fell silent. Van Stee started his farewell speech theatrically. Renz, dear Renz, and of course, your beautiful Zealandian wife March. Finally, he picked up a piece of paper from the table and continued, even louder, after exactly 38 years, you are leaving the police corps. Van Stee dived back in time to 30 years ago, when he had met Renz. He highlighted the milestones in investigations and alternated them with anecdotes. We hope you will be able to find some work in your wife's painting company for a while. Art gallery, March corrected softly. What I'm trying to say is that I hope you'll enjoy your retirement in good health for a long time. He raised his glass. Gentlemen, he said, forgetting the ladies, there is wine on this table for a reason. Let's make a toast to the health of this old fox and his painting wife. A few more jokes and hilarious additions sounded before everyone had raised their glass. Cheers! The sound dimmed with everyone nipping their wine. It was remarkably quiet for a moment until a noise started to emerge from the very end of the table. Can you dial it down a bit there in the back, gentlemen? It got noisier instead. Crockery and glasses tinkled. A woman screamed. That's enough, gentlemen. But it didn't stop. At the end of the table, people were getting up from their seats. Chairs slid over the floor, and some officers started to walk back and forth. Can you please behave for a change at a gathering like this, Taylor? The young sergeant, often called a playboy by his colleagues, couldn't change his behavior. He was sliding back and forth on his chair, breathing heavily, and making a gurgling sound. It almost seemed like Taylor wanted to say something, but he didn't manage any more than a couple of unintelligible words. If he had been eating fish, you would think that he had a large sharp bone in his throat, and he was nearly suffocating. A young police officer gave him a firm slap on his back, but the victim couldn't bear that well-meant blow. His body shot forward on the table, and his head landed on a plate as if it had just been served. He hadn't managed to break his fall, but he'd let go of his throat. His arms were stretched out in front of him and pointed to the other side of the table. Deputy Chief Constable Van Stee stretched his neck to try and see across the room. What is going on? Taylor has become unwell, Renz heard as two men answered at the same time. Someone in the back left the canteen abruptly. A woman diagonally opposite the victim began to wail. Renz saw Sergeant de Rosenaar walking towards the wailing lady with his phone to his ear. Renz also wanted to get up, but March pulled him down by his jacket. Just sit down. It could be serious, said Renz. I'm sure it is, but it's better not to get involved. You are retired now. There are plenty of police officers around. Let Inspector Monroe handle this, commanded the chief of police. He put his hand on Renz's shoulder and pushed him back into his chair to underline his command. Retired. March kicked Renz in the shins from under the table. The uproar at the end of the table was only getting worse. The woman opposite Taylor started screaming "Mamma Mia" with both arms in the air, and another woman ran out of the canteen. Van Stee had a good overview of the battlefield at the head of the table. He did not leave his seat. He didn't even move when a policeman at the other end said, "Sir, I'm sorry. We think that Officer Taylor has passed away." Later, March swore that she had seen a smile on the chief of police's face then, and heard him mumbling, "Well done." Renz was quite surprised at how the chief strictly remained in his seat without getting involved or giving any orders. It seemed as though he didn't think the incident was that important. The otherwise boisterous Jill Van Hanegem, a young police trainee whose uniform made her look like a schoolgirl who refused to grow up, had hurried to the head of the table like some sort of messenger. The tough young woman with her spiky black hair was not impressed, even when she bumped into the chief of police, who finally started to move. "What on earth is going on over there?" "Sergeant de Rosenar is trying to give Taylor first aid." The chief of police walked past the 28-year-old novice as if she wasn't there. "It's looking pretty serious," but Monroe didn't even want to call an ambulance at first, Jill continued to Renz. Renz asked if Taylor had said anything. "Nothing," said Jill. "Not a word. He couldn't talk." Renz wanted to go and see, but March did not let him get up. He got his mobile phone out of his pocket, which was quite tricky in a tight suit, and handed it to Jill. Most people were annoyed by her boldness, but he appreciated her for it. "Take pictures," he ordered, ignoring March's disapproving look. "Take pictures, boss?" "Of what?" "Everything." Jill turned back towards the scene. Renz pulled the young woman back by her belt. "Everything, Jill. Not just Taylor, but everyone around him," he whispered. "Why?" "Their looks, the faces." Jill stared at the man who had been her coach from the moment she joined the police as an intern. "You don't think it's that serious, do you?" "Taylor is just unwell." Renz nodded towards the scene. "A strong and healthy guy like that doesn't just collapse. You know his reputation. Eventually, he'd get himself in trouble. I'm afraid that is today." His sharp-witted colleague looked up as if she'd gotten a wake-up call and hurried back to her seat at the table. As the young trainee disappeared, March asked, "Take pictures?" "For my photo book," Renz replied, "a memory of my farewell party." It wasn't a party anymore. Renz Fox and March found themselves driving home sooner than expected. There were 2 folding bikes in the boot of the car, still in their box. They were a farewell gift for Renz to enjoy his freedom. The car's dashboard lights were glowing. Renz was driving steadily with the illuminated odometer no higher than 110 kilometers per hour. The music of Bob Dylan, when he still had a singing voice, played softly in the background. Renz's thoughts pondered on young Sergeant Taylor. An ambulance had come to take his body away. Everyone thought he died a natural death, the obvious conclusion in a canteen filled with police officers. That first assumption was a big mistake, according to Renz. "They moved the body from the crime scene without any investigation," he said. "You see a crime in every innocent death," said March. "I know it's not my job anymore, but mark my words, there will be an investigation tomorrow." March laughed softly, although Renz was usually right when it came to police work. "An investigation? Are you thinking of murder?" Renz didn't answer. He stared into the dark of the unlit highway between Dordrecht and Bergen op Zoom while Dylan was singing "The Times They Are Changin'." An hour later, Renz quietly passed the farm of neighbor Knut and continued along the gravel track onto his own yard. A light above the house reacted to their movement and flashed on. A bat, or some other creature, fluttered under the light. Renz was the first to get out of the car. He smelled the cattle and manure in Knut's stable as soon as he opened the door. He waited for March and locked the car door behind her with the button on his key. While March switched on the lights inside, the newly retired police inspector couldn't wait to see the photographs on his phone. He went through them a few times over and grabbed the landline phone in the corner of the room. Renz dialed Jill's private number, which he knew by heart, without even thinking about the time of night. March found herself shaking her head in the kitchen, making a cup of tea before bed. Jill answered quickly. "Who is this?" "Me." Renz heard her laughing. "I thought it would be." "Why?" "Someone died." It wouldn't be the first time that Renz Fox wakes me up for that. "Am I doing that now?" "Not yet. I was just talking to Richard about Taylor's sudden death." "But it is midnight." "What's up? Have you seen the pictures you took on my device?" "Well, no. I took them myself, I was there. I've seen it firsthand." "Did you not notice anything strange?" "Not really." "Do you know the two people opposite Taylor?" Inspector Monroe was sat opposite him. "I mean on either side of Monroe. An officer, I don't remember who. And a woman I don't know. Try to find out who we're talking about tomorrow, please, both the officer and the woman. Call me when you know more." March entered the cozy living room with a jug of tea, stopped, and listened while shaking her head. She wasn't really surprised. She heard Renz finishing his conversation with "Just do it, Jill. It won't do any harm. You know that's not the point, Mr. Fox. The investigation has been assigned to Monroe, not to you." Renz raised his thumb and grinned. "So, there is going to be an investigation?" He pulled a chair towards him and sat down. "How come so fast? And why Monroe instead of Van Belzen?" Jill told him what she knew. Renz told March what he had heard from Jill. The deciding factor had been the reaction of Taylor's girlfriend, who was sitting next to him. At one point, she grabbed Taylor's half-empty glass of wine, threw the contents into the face of the woman opposite her, and said, "You bitch. You'll be glad of Taylor's suffering. You like to see him in pain, don't you?" My goodness. The girlfriend had gotten up before the woman could even react, and approached Van Stee, remember? Whatever it was, she told our chief of police or Monroe must have prompted them to look at Taylor's death from a different perspective. March sat back in her chair and studied her tea glass. "I had a look at Taylor's girlfriend. She is a good-looking woman with long blonde hair. Strikingly beautiful. She wore a daring, tight-fitting red dress. I would say she is the type that suits a playboy like Taylor." March got up and snatched Renz's empty tea glass from him. "I imagine you'll want to know how this story continues." She walked towards the kitchen and stopped at the door. "Just try not to interfere." When his wife returned from the kitchen, Renz was already playing with the pictures on his phone again. He held the device up for her to see. "Here, look." March bent over to see the screen up close. "That's the victim, isn't it?" "Eesh, why do you need to look at this over and over again? He's lying with his arms spread out on the table. He may already be dead in this picture." "You're right." Renz turned his phone off. "It's typical," he said cryptically. "What's typical?" "They completely missed the first and most obvious clue, as usual, and they removed the body from the crime scene. This picture is the only capture of the crucial moment itself." Renz tapped his head with his index finger. "And it's in here, of course." March got up to go to bed. "You should leave this case to Monroe." Yes, Inspector Monroe. Monroe, instead of Van Belzen. Taylor had wanted it that way himself. Jill told me that Monroe's name was one of his last words. March looked up before she disapprovingly turned off the lights. "His last words? I thought he didn't have any." Renz got up as well. Jill thought so too, but help, Monroe was the last thing he said, although it may not even get mentioned in his file. Taylor must have understood that his sudden distress did not just come out of the blue. He may have expected an attack. He wanted to say something to the man with the highest rank right in front of him. Fox stood up and followed his wife. A murder in a full canteen, with over 20 policemen present, he muttered, "We have to find out who would benefit from Taylor's death tomorrow." March gave him a friendly push. "Tomorrow we're going shopping in Goes or Middleburg." Renz and March's house was surrounded by flat fields that grew golden waving corn in summertime. This time of year, they looked bare and dark with the black and gray plowed clay. The small, sturdy farmhouse, extended with a conservatory of glass and a converted barn that March used as an art studio, stood in no man's land with its nearest neighbor 100 meters away. Outside, a westerly wind blew steadily. It smelled like coffee inside. The local newspaper was waiting on the doormat. Renz settled into his wicker chair in the conservatory, read something about the nearby harbor, and thought to himself that he had read the same story 4 years ago. He asked March where in Zeeland the village Zutland was, where a car collision had taken place, and he smiled at the newspaper's cartoons. He put the newspaper aside, wondering what to do next. March zipped up her coat and went out to take the large brown box out of the car. The folding bikes. An hour later, Renz had started the assembly, cut his hand at the sharp edge of the chain guard, and decided to postpone the construction of the second bike until Sunday. In the afternoon, as the weather improved, the Middleburg market at the foot of the historic town hall provided some distraction. Renz watched I Love Holland on TV later on and rented a VOD police series afterward. The assembly of the second bike was postponed again on Sunday. "It's too cold now, we'll only use it in the summertime anyway." Renz tried to read a book. He restlessly walked to the kitchen and, more out of boredom than interest, lifted the lid of a pan to see what was for dinner that evening. He tried the television again, zapped past 2 church services, and watched a travel program with images of Austrian mountains covered in fresh snow. March proposed to buy a tablet computer to use for playing games and using Facebook. "It'll be a nice way to stay in touch with your former colleagues." The Monday after that, Renz Fox was eager to contact his ex-colleagues at the office. He did his best to control himself until 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he finally picked up the phone and called Amsterdam. March laughed with a hint of mockery. "Who are you calling?" Covering the phone with his hand, Renz lied, "The administration. My pension papers have not been completed yet." "That sounds important. I hope they'll settle that right away." At the office, de Buchelaar sounded surprised. "That's what retirement does to old people," he teased Renz, "they lose their memory. Did you forget you visited me last week? Or are you calling for a different reason?" "Last week? Ah, I remember now. Listen, Buchelaar, now that I've got you on the phone anyway, can you just put me through to Van Belzen?" Renz would-be successor soon picked up. "Is that you, Fox?" March shook her head and left the room when Renz started to ask his colleague questions as if he was sitting opposite him in an interrogation. After his conversation with Van Belzen, Renz got up to find his wife. He walked to her art studio, which was illuminated by the light of Zeeland, and opened the glass sliding doors. He found Marge inside, sitting on a high chair behind the easel. "Did de Buchelaar get your pension papers sorted?" his wife asked as soon as she stepped in. "Well, it was a good thing I called. I happened to speak to Van Belzen as well. Accidentally, of course. Taylor has been murdered. That's official now." It was no surprise, and yet March could hardly hide that she was shocked. "That's awful. We were right there. He must have been poisoned." "Yes, I get that. Everyone would have noticed if he'd been shot or stabbed." In her dusty jacket full of paint, she turned on her chair to look at Renz. "What are you thinking? Are you wondering how the culprit has done it? That seems obvious to me. Taylor must have been poisoned by the wine that was already on the table. There is no official result yet, but I'm sure that will be the cause. The killer must have used potassium cyanide or a similar poison that wears off quickly. Taylor was shaking before he died. 1 gram of potassium cyanide would have been enough to kill him. I suppose Taylor felt unwell at first and didn't immediately think of poisoning. As soon as it started to dawn on him, it was already impossible for him to speak. Renz got up to leave the studio again. His hand moved to the latch of the sliding doors. What now? What are you going to do? March wanted to know. I'm going to call Jill again. Don't even think about it, March tried softly. Renz had a fierce expression on his face. I can't let the murder of a colleague go unpunished, can I? You are retired. There were about 30 people in that canteen, and most of them police. Anyone could be the culprit. You would have to talk to everyone, and you simply can't. Forget it, Renz. You can't do anything. You're powerless, and you have to accept that. Renz hesitated for a moment and let go of the latch. He took his phone out of his pocket and stepped up to March. Please, just look at this picture. Taylor, the otherwise lively young man, was lying dead on the table. His arms spread out in front of him. Geez, Renz. Take that away. Now that I know the man was poisoned, it's even more difficult to look at that photograph. Renz moved his thumb and index finger across the screen to zoom in. And what about this? Renz asked without further explanation. About what? Why are you showing me the hand of a dead man? Do you see what he is holding? A fork, or a spoon, I'm not sure. It's upside down. I can only see the handle. Renz made a theatrical gesture of despair. What normal person holds a fork or spoon like that? You think he's holding it like that for a reason? Imagine falling forward unsuspectingly. What would that look like? You'd knock over glasses, everything would slide aside, but you wouldn't put your hand on a fork and turn it over so that it points in the other direction. March looked at the picture again. Maybe you're right. Of course I'm right. This is no coincidence. The investigation should start with the people who were sitting opposite Taylor. To whom the fork points. There weren't 30 people present, only 2. Jill will find out more about them. March took a little time to think before telling Renz to call Inspector Monroe. That won't help. He won't even speak to me. Monroe has fought a long battle with Van Belzen about the succession. He sits on my chair now. No, he doesn't want any interference. Monroe has lost his wife just over a month ago. 2 days later, the inspector was already back at work again, terrified to lose his promotion. Monroe would rather have no result than a result in which my name appears. So, what can you do? I can think. You've been fretting all weekend. Did you not think I'd notice? You think you can still solve this case? This is a colleague we're talking about. I can't just let this disappear into the bin, can I? That stupid Monroe has had the whole crime scene destroyed. That says enough. Van Stee has simply chosen the wrong successor, although Van Belzen probably wouldn't do any better. And you've heard the chief of police rattling on about your painting company. He thinks you paint houses, even though I told him about your art gallery at least 1,000 times. You can't expect much insight from such a boss. March suddenly jumped up and bumped into her easel. Brushes and tubes of paint clattered on the tiled floor. Here's a thought. You should consider 3 suspects, instead of 2. Renz looked at her in surprise. Just 1 minute ago, you said I shouldn't interfere at all. Remember that Taylor's girlfriend threw Taylor's wine in the face of the woman opposite her? March asked. Yes, I do. I'm sure everyone remembers that. Well, maybe she just wanted to get rid of the poison before someone else would drink it. Or maybe she wanted to get rid of the evidence. Renz thought aloud, that could be possible. I think the office will consider that as well, though. March bent down to pick up her brushes. Renz admitted, you are right. Maybe there are 3 primary suspects. The 2 who were sitting opposite Taylor, and his girlfriend next to him. Was it nostalgia for his old job, or purely jealousy that caused Renz to have little faith in his successor? It was only logical that his successor locked him out. It had started Friday evening in the police canteen. As Renz had finally gotten to the end of the table to take a closer look at Taylor, Monroe had pushed him away, irritated. The new inspector had pushed his long body between Renz and the victim so that Renz had to stand on his toes to see the table scene over Monroe's shoulder. Of course, Monroe wasn't crazy. He had sniffed at Taylor's empty glass straight away. Renz didn't know that his colleague had been working non-stop after the killing. Monroe had consulted with the chief of police Van Stee for hours. Murder in the police canteen would be a heavy burden on the police corps. That was to be expected. Police higher up would want to get involved, and ultimately politics and press as well. The mayor is responsible for public order and the safety of the inhabitants of Amsterdam. After newspaper Het Parool would report that you are not even safe in a police canteen surrounded by more than 30 officers, the other media channels would quickly pick up on it. Broadcasters would fill their shows with self-appointed specialists and critics. Monroe knew the uncontrollable mechanism all too well. And if he didn't, Chief of Police Van Stee would. Everything gets turned upside down by the media. Even cases that don't matter at all get blown up out of proportion when there is a lack of news. All kinds of conspiracy theories will start to go around if this murder becomes public knowledge. The fragile details will start to live a life of their own. Renz expected that this was Van Stee's biggest concern. In Amsterdam, about 170 kilometers away from Zeeland, Monroe and Van Stee decided to interview all those who were present on Friday evening. That number of interviews was too large to conduct on one day, so Jill Van Hanegem was assigned the task to make a schedule. Colleagues who previously had been hostile towards Taylor had to be interviewed first. 7 people had been excluded in advance: Van Stee and his young wife, Accountant de Buchelaar, because he had arrived later and could not possibly have put poison in Taylor's glass unseen; Van Belzen, who had waited for Fox in the hall; Renz Fox and his wife March, and Monroe himself. These were marathon sessions. Of course, they were interested to hear of any ties with Taylor and motives for murder. A questionnaire was drawn up, and the interviewees were asked whether their relationship with Taylor was friendly, whether they were friends with Taylor outside working hours, and whether Taylor had any enemies. One standard question was left out of the questionnaire: where were you at the time of the murder? All answers would be the same: in the canteen, at the victim's table. It was a bizarre situation. Renz was sure Taylor's girlfriend would be the first to be put to the test. Perhaps she was the culprit, although the location of the crime seemed like a strange choice. If she had been able to get potassium cyanide, she could have killed Taylor at home or during a dinner in a restaurant. Why would she risk it with so many police officers around? On the other hand, choosing the canteen could have been a smart move. She would have been the only suspect at home, and none of the waiters or visitors would have had a motive in a restaurant. There were a lot more possible suspects in the canteen. If the attractive lady is the offender, she has a sense of drama. She has chosen the perfect spot. "Do you like her?" March asked. "Who?" "Taylor's girlfriend." Instead of answering, Renz continued to complain about Monroe's approach because there was nobody else to complain about. Monroe should be focusing on the 2 people Taylor pointed at, but I don't think he understands. Taylor chose those 2 for a reason. But they're not necessarily murderers. You have to start somewhere, just like you start a book on the first page. Monroe is reading more than 20 pages in a random order if he interviews everyone. He'll make it way too difficult for himself, or even impossible. You don't think too highly of him. Monroe is not ready for this. His wife died just over 1 month ago. What has that got to do with it? I wouldn't be able to do this case if I had lost you. How sweet of you to say so. You have a grudge against anyone who takes the life of another after you lose a loved one. For a while, you are no longer objective, you are forced to look for a culprit. That's nonsense. Renz sighed. If you'd been in my profession for nearly 40 years, you'd understand. You don't just find dead bodies. You have to confront their family and tell them that they have lost their son or daughter. It's part of the job. The cause of death doesn't matter. There are clear similarities with people who have lost their husband or wife. They're angry. Unconsciously, they want to revenge death. Monroe is angry, I am sure of it. It's not a good foundation for objective research. Towards the end of Monday afternoon, when the sun was low in the sky and shone an orange light on Zeeland, Jill Van Hanegem called Renz. The phone line crackled, and the young sergeant sounded both excited and angry. "What's going on with you?" Renz asked. "I was one of the first to be interviewed by Inspector Monroe." "So now you're one of the suspects?" Renz joked. "That's not the problem, all of us are suspects. I'm angry because I'm not allowed to help with the investigation." Jill went quiet as if she had to think before continuing. "I want to be part of it. Maybe Monroe doesn't like you. We both know that you are not very diplomatic, young lady. It's your fault." "Why?" "Monroe asked me to share my thoughts on the incident. So, I started to tell him about the two people opposite Taylor, of course." Renz heard a mocking laugh. Monroe got angry. "He asked me why I would point at those two. And he got even angrier when I told him this was your idea." Renz laughed so loudly that March looked up from her book in the other corner of the room and frowned. "You seem to like my humiliation. I can see humor in it." "I can't. I am not allowed to touch those dossiers now, and I have to focus on other work." "You can't blame Monroe. One of the members of the Corps is a murderer. He must be careful." "That's not the only reason." "What else?" "Inspector Monroe sees me as an extension of you. We've always worked well together. You are a troublemaker, Fox, and you know it. Monroe doesn't even want to hear your name. There have been too many problems between you two in the past. He's glad that you are gone. Van Stee as well, by the way. Now they want to involve me in as little as possible because we worked closely together. Those are their words, not mine. I'll consider that a compliment. Monroe has simply prohibited me from talking to you. I'm calling you on my own phone right now. It doesn't feel right." March studied her husband from the side. Renz was no taller than the average man. He didn't look like a 60-year-old, she thought, even though his hair was gray. Renz was fit, although he had lost all sporadically organized tennis matches against their two children, who were in their 30s now. He complained about his back, but when they worked in the garden, you still wouldn't think he was 60. March's husband wore his dark brown corduroy trousers every day, with a plain polo shirt to match. When it was cold, he wore his winter camel jacket, which he actually wore in summer as well. March had bought him new clothes every now and then, but most of it was still untouched and in his wardrobe. So, she'd given up and only purchased corduroy trousers and polos that looked like his original outfit now. It wasn't easy to find another old-fashioned woolen jacket, though. Renz had worn his only suit on the evening of his retirement party. It was a bit too tight, which wasn't noticeable as long as he didn't button up the jacket. Renz looked handsome, and the low sun colored his face and the crow's feet around his eyes. March's friends thought that her husband was the same age as her, even though she was 10 years younger. Renz used to blame her for that. Yet, the years started to show. Renz had started to use the cheap reading glasses he had bought at the market in Middleburg. He really was getting older. Maybe March's husband was 2 or 3 kilos too heavy, but many others would have liked to be at his weight. "How is Amsterdam?" asked March, who had given up resisting his telephone interference and conspiracy with Jill. One of the two guests whom Taylor pointed to, the woman, turns out to be Van Stee's younger wife or girlfriend. March couldn't help but laugh. The young woman who got the red wine in her face. "I have a very attractive boss, don't you know? Tastes differ. She is much younger than Van Stee." "What else?" Jill struggles with the fact that she can't discuss certain things that could benefit the investigation. "You know how eager she is. So, You have reluctantly made yourself available to listen to her in Monroe's place? Taylor was a womanizer. He was known for that. He even used to charm the ladies within the police corps. Jill knows this. Renz smiled. The colleagues in the canteen don't talk about anything else now. It's like a hair salon full of women. You don't know anything about hair salon conversations, Renz. As a woman, you will understand where I'm going with this. There are rumors about Taylor dating Van Stee's wife, the young woman who was sitting opposite him. No wonder his current girlfriend threw red wine in her face. I can see why Taylor's girlfriend did that. An understandable reason to freak out during dinner. Not only that. There is more. What if it was a motive for murder? Suppose that Taylor's girlfriend only just found out about their history. Or what if the relationship with Van Stee's girlfriend wasn't over? In that case, we would be dealing with an old-fashioned crime of passion. That's crazy. Anyway, Jill can't talk about this, not with anyone. It would be difficult for her to tell Van Stee that his wife was probably seeing Taylor, especially now that she's been told not to interfere. She could talk to Monroe. Renz shrugged his shoulders. Monroe and Van Stee are friends. How did you think my successor got his promotion? If Jill tells Monroe what she knows, he'll run to Van Stee straight away. Will Van Stee not welcome any information that could help solve a murder in the police corps? Women. Renz sighed. You will never understand men. Van Stee wouldn't see it as valuable information, he would take it as an insult. The old man is proud of his young blonde partner. No one would dare to tell a man with a wig that his prize is sneaking around behind his back. Why should poor Jill have to tell him? Your boss wears a toupee. That's no secret. Jill can't talk about that relationship, and without this information, Taylor's girlfriend will undoubtedly remain the main suspect. So they already have their main suspect? That's fast. Jill said that Monroe has already drawn that conclusion. Taylor's girlfriend wanted to get rid of him. She used to work as a croupier at the casino, but she's been working with an internet company for the last 3 years. Monroe is already accusing her of internet fraud, thinking that Taylor discovered her fraudulent activities. Wendy Rose, the beautiful girlfriend, wanted to prevent Taylor from doing his duty. That's what Monroe suspects. How can Monroe possibly know all this so quickly? It's possible that Van Stee's girlfriend told him all this. Wendy Rose has already sowed doubt by throwing that wine in the young woman's face. Maybe she was getting rid of the poison before someone else would accidentally drink it. That's what may have happened, of course. So that's how she's become the first suspect in Monroe's investigation. Probably. He doesn't know anything about Jill's picture of the fork. And you don't know anything about Wendy Rose. Except for what Jill told you about her. March could tell Renz Fox was not at ease that Monday night. He forgot to watch the 8 o'clock news and didn't even turn on the TV. She didn't get a response to her second proposal to buy a tablet computer with games to kill time. When she suggested driving to the city of Knock to visit an art gallery that featured her work, he wasn't even listening. At 9 o'clock, Renz got up from his chair and called Jill and asked if she knew anything more about the other person opposite Taylor yet. Renz listened to Jill's answer. Well? March asked when Renz put the phone down, does she know more? The man who was sitting opposite Taylor was Ster Hendricks, one of our colleagues. I remember now, he was wearing his uniform. I think he's around 40 years old, and he lives in Brabant. His family builds farm buildings. They invented something new to milk cows with. A more animal-friendly way with less chance of irritation and inflammation. Now get this, Taylor invested in that project. He wasn't the only one, more people in the Corps got involved in that project. Sturt is ambitious and tenacious. A good salesman too. Were you involved as well? Yes, I invested quite a lot. And you never mentioned it to me? How much did you invest? €50. €50? Don't be ridiculous. I wouldn't call that a lot. You can't build stables or machines with that. That was the minimum amount. Every investor received a certificate and is kept informed. I thought it would be fun. Did Taylor invest a lot of money? Did he maybe use the money from his girlfriend's gambling table or fraud? I don't know. Does Monroe know about the stables and the money? Renz shrugged his shoulders. There are no secrets there. We like to talk about it at work. You're not around for all of that work talk anymore. I bet you'd want to hear what they're saying now. That too, but that's not my point. Then what is your point? Considering Van Stee's wife's adventures and Stuart's projects, it's simply too soon to appoint Wendy Rose as the murderess. Investigators often suffer from tunnel vision and focus on only one person they'd like to see in jail. For Monroe, that could be Rose. Renz and March kept to their own thoughts, until later that night. Walcheren can get noticeably quiet once the wind subsides, surrounded by miles and miles of flat land. There wasn't much light in the living room, and the only sound was the ticking of one clock. March broke the silence. You're going to have to figure this out. What do you mean? Renz asked. Well, you'll solve it, like you always do. Find the murderer. It is unfair for such a young woman to be wrongly accused. She has just lost her boyfriend. Now it's my time to ask why. I am retired, remember? March closed her book. Don't be a hypocrite, Renz. I know you've been working on a plan for a few days now. Renz didn't say anything to that. Just promise me one thing. March demanded. No, wait, 2 things. And these things are? March got up. First, that this really will be your last case. Second, that we're going to go to sleep now. It was Wednesday morning. The old Fox was following a truck through the Vlake Tunnel towards Noord-Holland. Renz was wearing his dark gray suit for the second time this year. The collar of his white shirt hung over a black sweater. No tie today. March was dressed in a woolen jacket of the same color as Renz's suit. The times where everyone wears black to a funeral were long gone. 2.5 hours later, the car approached the parking lot of Westerveld Cemetery, beautifully situated in a slightly hilly park behind the dunes. The canopies of tall trees masked the cemetery as though it was overcast with low clouds. The traffic was far away and could not be heard, so even the living visitors could enjoy peace and tranquility. When my time has come, I would like to be buried here, March said softly. It's beautiful, and not as lonely as Zeeland. Westerveld is one of the oldest private cemeteries in the Netherlands, as well as the first crematorium, Renz Fox had read when he had looked for the address on the internet. Taylor's family, friends, and colleagues met in the Marius Poelzel, which had been furnished in Art Deco style from 1913. I don't like funerals, March said, and she added, I joined you today, provided that you stay by my side, Renz. I hardly know anyone here. Renz was planning to speak to as many people as he possibly could, but whether he actually could with March by his side was the question. The funeral service consisted of various speeches but gave little new information about the murder of Taylor. In fact, the murder word was taboo. Chief of Police Van Stee, who read his speech from a piece of paper, described it as the completely unexpected departure of a respected police officer. Taylor's brother shared memories that had nothing to do with his police career. He talked about their youth together and finished with a few anecdotes about sports. Taylor's girlfriend Wendy, moved to tears, let everybody know how she cherished the short time she had been with the deceased. Taylor outside of work wasn't the same as Taylor the police officer. She described him as a nice person with a great sense of humor. He had always been true to his loved ones. March could tell that Renz Fox was not at ease that Monday night. He forgot to watch the 8 o'clock news and didn't even turn on the TV. She didn't get a response to her second proposal to buy a tablet computer with games to kill time. When she suggested driving to the city of Knock to visit an art gallery that featured her work, he wasn't even listening. At 9 o'clock, Renz got up from his chair and called Jill and asked if she knew anything more about the other person opposite Taylor yet. Renz listened to Jill's answer. Well? March asked when Renz put the phone down, does she know more? The man who was sitting opposite Taylor was Ster Hendricks, one of our colleagues. I remember now, he was wearing his uniform. I think he's around 40 years old, and he lives in Brabant. His family builds farm buildings. They invented something new to milk cows with. A more animal-friendly way with less chance of irritation and inflammation. Now get this, Taylor invested in that project. He wasn't the only one, more people in the Corps got involved in that project. Sturt is ambitious and tenacious. A good salesman too. Were you involved as well? Yes, I invested quite a lot. And you never mentioned it to me? How much did you invest? €50. €50? Don't be ridiculous. I wouldn't call that a lot. You can't build stables or machines with that. That was the minimum amount. Every investor received a certificate and is kept informed. I thought it would be fun. Did Taylor invest a lot of money? Did he maybe use the money from his girlfriend's gambling table or fraud? I don't know. Does Monroe know about the stables and the money? Renz shrugged his shoulders. There are no secrets there. We like to talk about it at work. You're not around for all of that work talk anymore. I bet you'd want to hear what they're saying now. That too, but that's not my point. Then what is your point? Considering Van Stee's wife's adventures and Sturt's projects, it's simply too soon to appoint Wendy Rose as the murderess. Investigators often suffer from tunnel vision and focus on only one person they'd like to see in jail. For Monroe, that could be Rose. Renz and March kept to their own thoughts, until later that night. Walcheren can get noticeably quiet once the wind subsides, surrounded by miles and miles of flat land. There wasn't much light in the living room, and the only sound was the ticking of one clock. March broke the silence. You're going to have to figure this out. What do you mean? Renz asked. Well, you'll solve it, like you always do. Find the murderer. It is unfair for such a young woman to be wrongly accused. She has just lost her boyfriend. Now it's my time to ask why. I am retired, remember? March closed her book. Don't be a hypocrite, Renz. I know you've been working on a plan for a few days now. Renz didn't say anything to that. Just promise me one thing. March demanded. No, wait, 2 things. And these things are? March got up. First, that this really will be your last case. Second, that we're going to go to sleep now. It was Wednesday morning. The old Fox was following a truck through the Vlake Tunnel towards Noord-Holland. Renz was wearing his dark gray suit for the second time this year. The collar of his white shirt hung over a black sweater. No tie today. March was dressed in a woolen jacket of the same color as Renz's suit. The times where everyone wears black to a funeral were long gone. 2.5 hours later, the car approached the parking lot of Westerveld Cemetery, beautifully situated in a slightly hilly park behind the dunes. The canopies of tall trees masked the cemetery as though it was overcast with low clouds. The traffic was far away and could not be heard, so even the living visitors could enjoy peace and tranquility. When my time has come, I would like to be buried here, March said softly. It's beautiful, and not as lonely as Zeeland. Westerveld is one of the oldest private cemeteries in the Netherlands, as well as the first crematorium, Renz Fox had read when he had looked for the address on the internet. Taylor's family, friends, and colleagues met in the Marius Poelzel, which had been furnished in Art Deco style from 1913. I don't like funerals, March said, and she added, I joined you today, provided that you stay by my side, Renz. I hardly know anyone here. Renz was planning to speak to as many people as he possibly could, but whether he actually could with March by his side was the question. The funeral service consisted of various speeches but gave little new information about the murder of Taylor. In fact, the murder word was taboo. Chief of Police Van Stee, who read his speech from a piece of paper, described it as the completely unexpected departure of a respected police officer. Taylor's brother shared memories that had nothing to do with his police career. He talked about their youth together and finished with a few anecdotes about sports. Taylor's girlfriend Wendy, moved to tears, let everybody know how she cherished the short time she had been with the deceased. Taylor outside of work wasn't the same as Taylor the police officer. She described him as a nice person with a great sense of humor. He had always been true to his loved ones. After the funeral, March and Renz Fox walked arm in arm along a sloping footpath with well-maintained graves to the left and right. It was past 4 o'clock when they entered the car park, and it was getting dark. "You seem to be having quite a good time," March said with a gentle tone in her voice, while the gravel gritted under their feet. "I thought you promised to stay close to me." "I couldn't help myself with all those colleagues around. A funeral is sometimes more like a reunion." March squeezed her arm around his. "I don't mind, darling. What do you think? Should we look for a cozy restaurant? Perhaps in Zandvoort? Or we could drive to Norwich." "I have something else in mind," Renz answered. "Beekstein. You will meet someone there who I'm sure you'll like." March stopped and pulled on Renz's arm. "A meeting? With Wendy Rose? You are unbelievable. Is that really necessary? We'll find out soon enough." In the atmospheric Beekstein restaurant, Wendy Rose walked straight up to Renz Fox's table as soon as she saw him. Dressed in black, with a simple round red brooch on the left side of her chest, the blonde woman looked different and with less bravura than she did in her tight dress a week ago. She was stunning. Wendy wasn't alone. Just behind her stood an older lady of small stature. Wendy introduced her as Mrs. Fanny Smits, Taylor's mother. "I'm sorry, I couldn't let her go home alone after the funeral and all that sadness." A waiter took their coats. March ordered coffee as the ladies took their seats at a round table set with white linen. Wendy combed her bright blonde hair back with an elegant hand, her nails colored with black nail polish. "You are Mr. Fox, aren't you?" "Renz Fox," the old lady asked. Renz nodded. "Taylor admired you." "I liked him, madam," Renz replied to Taylor's mother. "You had an active and driven son." "I did," the woman agreed. Wendy continued the conversation. "If I'd ever have any problems, Taylor said I had to knock on your door. So, here I am. Do you have problems?" The answer came from Taylor's mother, undoubtedly. "If she can't resolve them quickly, she'll end up in prison." The coffee was served. Everyone used milk and sugar. For a moment, you could only hear the small spoons against the china of the coffee cups. "My successor is very skilled in what he does," Renz lied. "My son Taylor wouldn't agree with that." Unexpectedly, March joined the conversation with a question. "Can I ask something?" March looked at Renz, who nodded back. "Yes, you can." March continued, "Why did you throw that glass of wine into the face of the woman opposite you?" Taylor's girlfriend looked at Renz. He shrugged his shoulders. "Do you know that woman?" "I've known her for a long time, but I met her in person for the first time on Friday." "Then you have." March didn't get any more words in as Wendy interrupted her. "The tramp is Van Stee's new wife. You know that, don't you?" "I heard, yes. But that has nothing to do with my question." "I was surprised to hear about the glass of wine. That woman tried to steal my man." Wendy's eyes sought the older woman, looking for support from her companion. "Didn't she, mother?" "She did try," the gray woman confirmed. "She was stalking my son. Called him day and night, did the boss's wife. She gave Taylor a hard time." Renz jumped back into the conversation, suggesting that he would ask the questions and that March could interrupt him if he missed something important. They listened to the family history of the murdered young man for an hour. Wendy's description matched with what Renz already knew. Taylor had definitely been the womanizer everyone in the police corps had suspected. 10 years ago, He used to boast about his conquests with women, while older police officers were just talking about soccer matches. Renz had thought that Taylor was mainly bragging to fit in and get attention, but he had proven to be just as ambitious when it came to his career. He always had a desire to score and win. He was a dedicated colleague who worked around the clock. Renz said, "I assume Monroe got permission to check your bank account. He will have seen your income, but he won't have been able to find any tax payments. Because there haven't been any. Like I said, tax is due at the end of the year." Wendy made an effort to hide her frustration. "That man is after me, and it scares me. I can understand his thoughts about the wine, but my job, our investments, and the tax man have nothing to do with Taylor's death. Do you understand? We are afraid Monroe uses everything he can possibly find against Wendy," Taylor's mother said. "That's why we wanted to speak to you." Renz answered, "There are 2 other possible suspects Monroe could be looking at. Maybe that helps a little. I'm sorry, but I can't tell you who they are." The 4 enjoyed their dinner and talked about this and that. Taylor's education and job, Renz Fox's anecdotes, and March's art exhibitions. Renz asked Wendy if Monroe had already searched her and Taylor's house. She confirmed that he had. "Did he take anything?" Renz asked. She didn't know. Taylor's mother shared some memories from her son's youth towards the end of dinner. Renz had asked about Taylor's early years when he was still a child. "His bedroom is still as it was, including his Lego and little Ferrari cars," Mrs. Smith said with a faint smile. Renz's final question surprised all 3 women. "Could I see Taylor's room?" "Yes, I suppose so." "When?" Renz figured that Monroe probably had the same idea, so he proposed to come over 2 days later. "Why not tomorrow? We could stay the night at a hotel?" March suggested. "That won't be possible, I have an appointment with Stuart Hendricks in Brabant tomorrow," replied Fox. They agreed to visit on Friday. When Wendy and Mrs. Smits made up to leave Beekstein, Renz decided to make the women aware that there was a good chance that Wendy would be arrested. Wendy seemed to understand, but Mrs. Smits said, "That's ridiculous, will she just be arrested to be interrogated?" The young woman bravely replied that she hoped it would benefit the investigation. There had to be a reason why Taylor had called for Monroe's help. "And I have nothing to hide," Wendy added. Renz Fox could reassure her with the knowledge that if she did get arrested, she'd probably be let go again soon. "You will remain innocent until there is a ruling from the judge. And whether you are guilty or not, I have seen very little proof so far." "That still doesn't sound very pleasant," the mother said. "What I meant is that you won't end up behind bars innocently," Renz said consolingly. "She is innocent." During the dark drive home, March repeated it over and over again. "I'm sure she is." Renz wasn't. Don't underestimate the ambitions of a beautiful woman. Don't be so old-fashioned. She is innocent, you'll see. Women have an intuition for this. Let Monroe do his job. We'll find out soon enough. It was quiet on the road back to Zeeland. Renz didn't say a word. He would travel to Brabant tomorrow to visit Stuart Hendricks. March had learned about the appointment during dinner at Beekstein. "I didn't know you were suddenly ready to invest." "Well, I'm a certificate owner, a friend of Pig and Cow, and a pensioner. I will have to focus on new projects now. Who knows, milking installations may become my new hobby." March concluded, "If I'm right, and Wendy is innocent, you could find a clue in Brabant. Maybe Taylor discovered something criminal after losing his investment, or something along those lines. Sergeant Stuart Hendricks got nervous and killed Taylor before he could bring it out in the open. You forget Van Stee's wife, or is it his girlfriend? I'm not sure. Because Wendy emptied the glass of wine into her face. No. Because Taylor pointed at her as well. A crime passionate? You're getting old, Renz. Those days are long gone. The woman couldn't get Taylor, but she didn't want him to be with Wendy either. What do you think of that as a theory? Silly men's talk. It could be, but I'm going to ask Jill to follow that lead. I'll visit Farmer Hendricks tomorrow. We'll add all the ingredients to the soup and have a taste of the result next Saturday. March wasn't sure if she should be feeling happy. It is exciting, now that I'm involved a little. I can imagine why you loved your work. But I hope you can let go of it after this case is finished. At 3:30 at night, the car stopped in front of the house on the former island Walcheren, quiet and impressive against the dark sky. Renz felt the moist air creeping under his collar and rushed inside, shivering. He kicked off his muddy shoes in the hallway, at his wife's insistence. Many could love this part of Holland, as March did. But would he ever get used to the emptiness and silence? The next morning, Renz was back in his car on his way to the money-crazed Stur Hendricks. This was starting to feel like work. His thoughts drifted off to Van Stee's young wife, Nancy. He would have liked to speak to her at Taylor's funeral, but that had been impossible. She was untouchable behind the chief of the police's shield. Nancy had not left Van Stee's side. Was she hiding from tricky questions? Did Taylor point his upside-down fork to her that fateful evening, or to Hendricks? Maybe there would be an essential clue in the mysterious pictures Wendy mentioned. Had Monroe found this clue yet? And, who or what more showed this incriminating material? A slip-up of Mrs. Van Stee, who didn't want the photos to be brought to the light for her husband to see. Renz Fox hoped that Jill could gain some knowledge about Nancy from the gossip circuit. He had called his eager ex-colleague this morning before he entered Brabant into his satin AV. Jill didn't know much about Nancy, just that she was a tailor in women's clothes. She had the same reputation as the deceased, flirting was her daily hobby. That was in line with Wendy's story. Whether Nancy had a personal motive to kill Taylor, Jill couldn't say. It sounds far-fetched, but if Nancy has a role in this, she will be hiding it for her husband. No, she's definitely not Van Stee's girlfriend. Yes, they're a married couple. Taylor knew something. I heard him talking about a woman who had been hit by her husband, but he left out any names. He never said whether it involved someone outside or inside the police corps either. It's possible he told Monroe, as I heard him say he would reveal something if Monroe wouldn't do it himself. Renz followed the friendly satin AV instruction: take the next turn to the left, while pressing number 3 on his hands-free phone to ring Jill again. Yes? She could be very short, which some colleagues mistook for arrogance. Do you think it's a good idea to ask Monroe about a dispute between Taylor and Van Stee? Ask Monroe? Give me 2 seconds. It stayed silent on the hands-free until Jill came back. I'm in the hallway now. You shouldn't call me at work. I don't want them to know that we talk. Renz understood. If they'd know about our investigation, they'd shut me out. Can you ask Monroe things off the record? I promise I will be more careful. Sometimes, Fox, you're as naive as a fairy tale. Do you really think that I, a trainee, can question Monroe? That would be an upside-down scenario. He's my boss. You asked me for plenty of things when I was in charge. And yes, you can be very annoying. But it helped. Could you play dumb in the canteen, and ask questions for everyone to hear? My name isn't Renz Fox. Well, it's just an idea. I'm going back to work. Bye. Jill hung up. Renz smiled. If he had been 30 years younger and didn't already know March, he probably would have tried to fight Jill's husband, Hans. The young woman always addressed Renz as you as soon as the workload increased and resumed to a formal Mr. Fox again when everything calmed down. Small of stature and flat as a dime, Jill could look like a boy in puberty, especially in her uniform. She had a unique mindset hidden under that prickly short black hair. Jill had a peculiar trait: she often didn't react when someone spoke to her, as if she lived in her own little bubble. It irritated Van Belzen, Monroe, and Van Stee. They were glad that she worked for Renz before, and not with them. Renz loved her character and attitude. In his thoughts, he imagined her addressing his colleagues with the same direct tone she used with him. As a trainee, you probably shouldn't say, "Hey Chief, wake up," to people like Monroe if he had overlooked something. Too much anger, and she would be sidelined, which would never lead to promotion. It was already more difficult for women, a pity, especially for the police corps. Renz promised himself to be more careful next time he called her again. Did Taylor really have such big secrets? Renz wondered as he drove past low detached houses into the village of Oarshot in Brabant. He should have asked Wendy, the victim's girlfriend, more about Taylor's relationships at the office. The stalking incident was either true or made up by Wendy. Was it the other way around, and was Playboy Taylor after Van Stee's wife? How much did Monroe know? And Van Stee? Did the murder have anything to do with Mrs. Van Stee? Or did the killer live here in Oarshot? Could it be that Van Stee had also invested in Stuart Hendricks' project? It wasn't a ghost floating through the Amsterdam police office that had poisoned Taylor's wine. Who had been sitting next to him and had access to his glass? Yes, his pretty girlfriend, Wendy. Who had been sitting on the other side of Taylor? And who had put the wine on the table to start with? Renz could think of a lot more conspiracy theories. He would have liked to question many more colleagues, as he didn't really have enough information. He was conscious that he was only searching in 3 directions. Wendy, and the 2 people opposite Taylor, the ones he had pointed to. There could be 4, 5, or 6 others. With his limited insight, it was easy to make mistakes. He parked the car in the yard of a large farm with a series of elongated low barns that had small oval windows just under the roof. It smelled like something Renz couldn't place. It resembled freshly mown grain, out of season, but it still tickled your nostrils. Maybe it was pig's feed. He couldn't say it stank. If 10,000 pigs lived here, like Stuart had told him before, it smelled amazingly fresh. Somewhere a dog had started to bark. Renz stood in front of a large rectangular farmhouse without any decoration or homeliness to it. 4 white-weathered plastic chairs and an old table stood outside, with dreary plants in pots scattered around. The front door opened. A friendly old man bent forward and said, "You must be Mr. Fox." He invited him in after he briefly introduced himself as Stuart's uncle. The living room looked like it had nothing done to it since the 50s. Stuart's uncle offered Renz a seat next to a solid wooden table. He asked if Renz liked coffee. Stuart joined them not much later, dressed in green overalls instead of a police uniform. "I hardly recognized you," Renz said and shook Stuart's hand. The men drank coffee and talked about the rumors surrounding Taylor's death. Stuart knew things Renz didn't know and talked about so-called friends of Taylor who he had met at the fitness studio. Monroe had interviewed one of them, a karate champion. 2 more cups of hot coffee later, Stuart led Renz through a long, wide corridor to a spacious room. The walls were brightly lit and sparkling white, very modern compared to the living room. Renz saw a large L-shaped desk with 2 computers. Except for one painting with a bright red pig, there was no decoration. The fan of one of the computers produced a monotonous humming sound. Stuart Hendricks gestured to a simple square table in the corner of the room. "This is it," Hendricks pointed out, "a scale model of our invention." Renz Fox was on his way back to Zealand 2 hours later, and not much wiser. Taylor had shown a lot of interest in the invention. He had never wanted to just invest, he had wanted to be involved as much as possible. His girlfriend Wendy was even more interested, Stuart had said. 3 days before his death, Stuart and Taylor had visited her house. The girlfriend is much more businesslike than Taylor was. "She didn't have any questions about the invention when I visited her, she only asked about the financials and the marketing." Renz was quite fascinated by the project as well. Hendricks hadn't only explained how the new cow-friendly invention worked, but he had also shown a video of the test installation working with real cows. Stuart had brought up the subject of shares as well. Renz could buy Stuart's uncle shares, who was happy to sell them. Renz managed to get back an hour before dinner time and showed Marge the glossy brochure he had gotten from Stjerd. She asked, "But you didn't really go to Brabant to discuss investment, did you?" Renz could only say that Hendrik's project was much more interesting than he had expected. The murder? No, unfortunately, I haven't discovered anything new. I suppose it could be easier for farmers to get access to chemicals. In combination with an acid, specialized companies can use it for pest control. But that's about it. Did you ask him about Taylor and Wendy's investment? A little, but Hendricks isn't stupid. He asked me straight away whether I had come for the project or because I couldn't let go of my police work. Did you not get anything out of him? He said that everyone's money was welcome, but he couldn't possibly trace where it had come from in the first place. He would notify Monroe if he discovered something strange. There was one piece of information worth remembering: Taylor had problems with a karate champion. Marge told Renz about the visit of a gallery owner that same afternoon, which was why she hadn't joined Renz on his trip to Brabant. She described the man vividly, a heavy man with a double chin. He had business relations in America. 4 of her paintings had been chosen for an exhibition in New York. Renz congratulated his wife. He was proud of her. Just before dinner was on the table, Renz's mobile phone rang. It was Jill, short and straightforward as ever. "Wendy Rose has been arrested." "As we expected," Renz said. "Now you can stop your illegal investigation, Renz." "Because Taylor's girlfriend has been arrested?" "Because a small portion of cyanide was found in her home. Less than 1 gram can be fatal." Marge filled their plates. "I was wrong. I really didn't think this woman was able to kill. To be honest, she seemed much more naive than I would expect from a former casino croupier." She paused for a second and continued, "I suppose you won't need to visit Wendy or Taylor's room anymore." Renz didn't look up. "You can go shopping and knock with me instead." Fox put his fork down and slowly shook his head. "It's even more important to see them now. I'd rather go as soon as possible. And I have to find a reason to talk to Monroe. Finding cyanide is one thing, but where did it come from? I must let him know that Stjerd Hendricks visited Wendy with Taylor 3 days before he died. I have to check if Monroe knows about the investments." On Friday morning, 1 week after Taylor's death, Renz Fox drove back to Amsterdam under a sunny blue sky. This time he was wearing his familiar casual clothes. He turned onto the Museumplein and said goodbye to Marge, who walked the rest of the way to the Van Gogh Museum. "Set your phone to vibrate and keep an eye on it, please." "I'll call you as soon as I'm done," Renz said. He drove to Amstelveen next, where the house of Monroe was situated on the edge of the Amsterdam forest. Renz had heard from Jill that Monroe was not on duty today. His best chance to talk to Monroe was without an appointment, by surprising him at home. Marge had warned him that this is not how you make friends. Renz had replied that friendship between him and Monroe was the last thing he was thinking about. He was curious about Monroe's reaction, and whether he would say anything about Van Stee's young wife, that was all. Renz parked at the curb just in front of the detached house. A lady with black hair and of about 40 years old opened the door instead of Monroe. Renz asked to see him. The lady hesitated at first but let him in after he told her that he was a former colleague. He found his astonished successor in a living room with a hard wooden floor and many dusty potted plants. The room looked out onto a spacious garden adjacent to the Amsterdam forest. Monroe stood up from an old-fashioned lazy chair with wooden armrests. "Renz? What are you doing here?" Renz reminded him of their conversation at the funeral. "As promised, I looked for a school photo of your wife. I couldn't find it, at least not the one from school." He handed over a photo taken 10 years ago in a restaurant. "She's standing next to you." Monroe looked at the photo and handed it back to Renz, irritated. "That isn't my late Rebecca." Renz studied the picture carefully. "You're right. How could I make such a mistake?" Yes, how could you? You went to the same school as Rebecca. Yes, but we weren't in the same class. Striking how much a person can change. There must be something wrong with your eyes. She doesn't look like my late wife at all, Monroe said with a serious face. Renz Fox apologized and promised to look for pictures again before he carefully touched on the sudden death of Monroe's wife. As I said, I never had the opportunity to express my condolences. He turned to the black-haired lady who had been sitting opposite the two men, listening. Or do you? The woman thanked him. Are you family? Renz asked. She shook her head. I'm just Monroe's neighbor. Again, Renz politely inquired about Mrs. Monroe's illness until he was reminded that she had died in an accident. An unlucky fall down the stairs. I prefer not to talk about it. The neighbor left the room, which was furnished with a hint of Art Deco, to make coffee. When he was sipping his coffee with warm milk, which apparently is better for your stomach, Renz asked about the progress at the police office. According to Monroe, their colleague Van Belzen had recovered from his disappointment of losing the battle for Renz's succession. He works alongside me as a loyal colleague now. It would take some time before Jill Van Hanegem would as well. The young woman came to work sulking every day, according to Monroe. Inevitably, the conversation landed on Taylor. Tragic, Monroe said. Luckily, we have arrested the murderess. Who is it? Renz played stupid. You don't know? Do you not read online news in Zealand? Monroe replied. I didn't read anything this morning. No time. March wanted to be in the Van Gogh Museum early to avoid the hustle and bustle. Monroe told Renz that he had arrested Wendy Rose. Taylor's girlfriend, he explained. It was quite obvious. A search of her house the day after the funeral provided the necessary evidence. We found a tiny amount of potassium cyanide in a little sugar bowl. Renz whistled between his teeth. TSSST, solved so quickly, my compliments. What were her motives? Monroe explained that her motives were not clear yet. Suspiciously large sums of money had gone through her bank account, something to do with an investment. The money stopped moving a few days before Taylor's death. On that ground, and because Wendy was sitting next to Taylor on that fateful evening, Monroe had asked for a search warrant. He had taken a computer, some dossiers, and found the poison. 1 + 1 was 2. Renz was perplexed but recovered his frown quickly. So you are trying to find a motive in the investment? Her public fight with the woman opposite her at the table has nothing to do with it? The suspect came up with an implausible story about stalking. Monroe smiled with a sneer, which was just ridiculous. Ridiculous? Why? Nancy is Van Stee's wife. They are married. Renz paused, sipped his coffee, and then played his next card. What about the photographs Taylor was working with? Renz asked. Monroe was surprised. What photos? I know nothing about photos. No snapshots of Mrs. Van Stee or any other woman? The tall inspector got up. His narrow head, pointy nose, and long neck made him look like a heron. That's enough, Fox. You can go now. Are you sure Nancy wasn't after Taylor? Monroe walked to the entrance, accidentally knocking one foot against a table leg, and roughly opened the door. You'll find your way back to Friesland. You mean Zealand. It doesn't matter where. Just leave. Renz wasn't going to make it that easy for him and remained in his chair. There has been talk of incriminating photographs. I thought that would be useful information for your investigation. The slim, tall man was getting angry now and struggled to get his words out. Incriminating photographs? I am certain that there aren't any. They don't exist, Renz. Could there be pictures of Mrs. Van Stee together with Taylor? Nancy and Taylor? Our victim had a certain reputation. Monroe seemed to calm down and thought about Renz's comment. Again, Fox, I don't know anything about any pictures. But if you are right, and they do exist, the murderess may have seen them. There's our motive. I understand why you generally ignore gossip, but you must have heard some bits about our Playboy Taylor and the beautiful Lady Van Stee. Some, Monroe admitted. She used to complain about Taylor stalking her, and I had the awful task of telling the chief of police. It took all of his efforts not to attack that idiot. Inspector Monroe walked back to his low armchair and sat down, his long legs crossed. The neighbor hadn't spoken one word. Now she whispered softly, "Photographs?" Renz took a sip of what was left of his cold coffee and looked at her over the edge of his cup. He saw a shrewd woman with dark eyes and a thick layer of makeup covering her face like a mask. He got up. "I have to go." Inspector Monroe kept his cool this time. "I'll show you out." Black and white family photos decorated the wall and the hallway. "I forgot, I only came over to express my condolences." Renz pointed towards the wall. "Who's your late wife?" His successor pointed to a photograph of a tall lady leaning on a walking stick. "I'm sorry," Renz said before leaving. Later that afternoon, after a quick lunch, Renz and March drove through Amsterdam. Renz told March about his visit and explained, "We have to find those pictures, or even better, the whole file." March wanted to know what those photos had to do with the case now that Wendy had been arrested. "It depends what's on them. It's unlikely you'll find anything. You just said Monroe didn't, so Wendy may have made them up to point you in a different direction." A cyclist waved a clenched fist at Renz because he didn't give him enough space on the road. March noticed Renz was distracted. "Pay some attention to the traffic, please." Renz didn't hear her, and contemplated. Maybe Monroe did find the photographs and hid them to help Van Stee. The cyclist pounded angrily against the car window. Renz didn't seem to notice. March made an apologetic gesture. "If Taylor was working on a case in which pictures played a significant role, it's strange they're not part of this murder investigation. But if they were, Wendy might go free. That's probably what's going on. We have to see those pictures if they exist." Renz braked abruptly for an old lady crossing the street. "Careful, Renz." They found a parking space for the car and walked along a canal to the Van Lennepkade. Taylor's mother, who lived on the second floor, used a buzzer to open the door. Renz and March took the narrow stairs and squeezed past a stroller and pushbike that were parked in the narrow hallway. Taylor's mother sighed. "Mr. Fox, I'm so glad you came even though Wendy is in prison. I hope that you are here because you believe she is innocent." Renz and March entered a small living room with a view over the quay. Renz was impatient. He politely declined the coffee and asked Mrs. Smits if he could have a look at Taylor's room straight away. Taylor's mother got up and walked to a cupboard in the corner. "I'll give you the key, although you won't find anything in there. Your colleague Mr. Monroe has already been." "A key?" Renz asked. "I thought Taylor lived here." "He lived on the next floor up," the mother explained. "But I can assure you, you won't find anything. I've got something here that might be more interesting for you." She opened a drawer while pointing at a door. "Taylor used to live here with us during his childhood. He had his own room in here and bought the third floor when he was ready to move out." Renz took the key and went upstairs. "The coffee is waiting for you, as well as some more useful information, Mr. Fox." Renz didn't expect to find much upstairs, but March saw the disappointment on his face when he came back down. Taylor's mother got up and opened the door to Taylor's old room. "There's only a bed and an electric train left in here," she said, "and something for you, as I said." Renz expected a keepsake of her son, but she came back with an envelope. Renz Fox opened the envelope. He was visibly shocked by the content. "I told you I had useful information for you. I thought you were talking about something from his childhood. Wendy decided to give these to you after our dinner in Beekstein. You could always decide to take these to the investigation officer," she said. Renz wanted to leave. They were stood outside on the quay half a minute later. What's in the envelope? March wanted to know. Renz got his phone out of his pocket. Who are you going to call? Jill. What's the rush? Renz took a moment to think with his hand on the phone. You're right. There is no reason to hurry at all. I'm just so excited. Can I see what's in that envelope? March asked. Are those photographs in there? Renz looked at her with a glassy gaze. Yes, there are pictures in it. But I don't know if I want to show them to you. He apologized, they're quite revealing. Spicy, you mean? I am an adult, Renz. No, far from spicy. The old Renz Fox tried to think. It's difficult. I don't really know what to do. Let's find a cafe, sit down, and think. Will you show me the photographs? If I were still a working police officer, I'd say no. These are for police eyes only. Let me sit down and decide in the cafe. A small restaurant or cafe is never far away in Amsterdam. They found one with old, wooden furniture and a lot of different spirits behind the bar. Renz took his time to go through the photographs, as well as a letter written by Taylor. This case is getting more mysterious every day, Renz said. His initial emotional response had left him. Objectively, he continued. If I were in charge, I would know where to start looking now. Unfortunately, I'm not in charge. If you know who did it, you'll have to do something. I know, but what? And how? Call Monroe, March suggested, not Jill. Renz Fox laughed a little. Well, no. I don't think that's a good idea. March shrugged her shoulders. If it's that difficult, show me the photos. I might be able to help you. The old fox hesitated for a second but stuck to his decision. I'm sorry, darling. This material is still intended for police officers' eyes only. March suggested sending the evidence to the police in a blank envelope. Do it now, today, so we can still enjoy a walk through the city. March looked through the window. Her eyes followed a Surinamese woman with a stroller. Send them directly to Van Stee. That's the best option you have. Although, she heard Renz thinking out loud. The Surinamese woman stopped and bent over the stroller to talk to her baby. March continued. To talk to Van Stee in person, he'd have to let you in first. I don't think he will because as a pensioner, you are an intruder. He'll just think you can't let go of your position as an inspector, and in a way, he'd be right. March thought for a second and asked with a frown, actually, why not Van Belzen or Monroe? Monroe said he didn't know about the photographs, but that's unlikely. If he knows about them, Monroe has lied to me. He must have had a good reason, Renz explained. But we know his reasons. Is it not Van Stee's wife Nancy on the photographs? Monroe wants to protect his friend and boss Van Stee. That's what we've been thinking from the start. As just one possibility, Renz answered. It was just speculation, remember. It seemed obvious because Wendy told us what was going on between Nancy and Taylor. He tapped the envelope. We know better now. This isn't just about adultery. We know better. I don't know anything if you keep those pictures for yourself. Renz Fox grimaced. I can tell you one thing. Van Stee's wife isn't on the photographs in this envelope. No Nancy? That's right. No Nancy. Then who is? I don't know. Well, I do have my suspicions, but I don't know this lady. I need someone to confirm her identity before I jump to conclusions. So it's not Wendy either? No. Just a woman we don't know? Then what's with the secrecy? Renz Fox had made up his mind. He ordered 2 beers, fished his phone out of his jacket, and dialed a number. It took a long time before someone answered. Yes? It was Jill, shorter than ever. Are you at the office? If you really want to know, I'm on the toilet. I can't answer a call from you at my desk, you know that. You promised to respect that, so don't tell me this call isn't extremely important. It kept silence. Believe me, it's important. Can you meet me at the Guyer? Only if absolutely necessary. At 5 o'clock, when I'm finished at work. No, right now. This is your job. Shit, Renz, I can't just leave like that. They will ask me why. What do I say? Renz replied mockingly, I'm sure you're smart enough to come up with a reason, Jill. As long as you don't slip any truth in there. Don't say anything relating to me or this case, you understand? So it's about Taylor? Don't ask me on the phone. Make up an excuse and get over here, Renz insisted, immediately. To the Guyer, you said. Did you mean the cafe in the mill? When Renz put the phone down, March teasingly said, So Jill, at last. Renz didn't listen because he was already calling somebody else. He whispered in the phone, Van Belzen, pretend it's your wife on the phone. Don't let anyone know it's me. Why not? Sounded a confused voice from the other end. Ist, Renz hissed. He asked Van Belzen to come over to the Guyer straight away. Renz's phone call was intriguing enough for Van Belzen to take it seriously. If Fox called and sounded like this, he'd have a good reason. Before they hung up, Renz heard him tell his colleagues that his wife was on the phone and that he had to leave office due to an emergency. My mother-in-law is suddenly feeling incredibly ill, Renz heard him say. The Guyer is an old mill, situated in the east of Amsterdam. It borders a former bathhouse converted into a brewery. Jill waited in the cafe while her unsuspecting colleague Van Belzen, the chubby man with an incredibly slow pace, was still on his way. You're not starting to show signs of dementia, I hope, young Jill said shamelessly when Renz walked in. Dementia is not something to joke about, said March. It's not a joke. I hope your husband didn't have me leave my desk for no good reason, Jill answered quite seriously. Renz Fox was too serious to laugh. Okay, you're not kidding. Tell me why I'm here. I'm assuming it has something to do with Taylor? Renz nodded yes but didn't make a sound. Instead, he said, one moment. I'm still waiting for someone else. A witness? Jill speculated enthusiastically. Well, no, not quite. Ah, there he is. Jill Van Hanegem looked over her shoulder, just as the heavy body of Van Belzen entered the Guyer. What's Van Belzen doing here? We could have driven here together. I didn't want anyone to see you leave together, Renz said. A man with a leather apron appeared at the table. All three of them ordered a beer. A special beer? The man asked. Renz replied that he could bring whatever he would recommend, and also ordered a white wine for March. Van Belzen, as surprised as Jill was, also wanted some clarification. What's going on, Fox? And why is she here? He said while pointing at Jill. He looked slantingly at March, who gestured to know nothing of anything. They were sat at a small round table with 4 chairs. Renz took the brown envelope with the words "This is sensitive" from under his woolen jumper. Jill told Van Belzen it was about Taylor, and the chubby policeman with his accent from Zealand told Renz that this case was nearly solved and closed. The poison was found at Wendy's house, Taylor's girlfriend. She has been arrested. We still have questions about her motive, and the woman denies everything, but the evidence is overwhelming. This is a motive, Renz said with a touch of drama. He opened the envelope and held up one of the photographs. Look at this. Gee, Jill said and turned away. Who is it? Van Belzen said, unfazed by the unpleasant scene. The photo showed a woman's skinny face, severely damaged. Who is she? It's difficult to see through all that blood and those bruises. But she seems familiar, I feel like I've seen her before, Van Belzen continued. That's a good start. I don't know her, but if she is who I think she is, you'll understand why you are here. Jill grasped at the envelope in Renz's hands out of pure curiosity. What else have you got there? March took a good look as well now. Renz let Jill take the envelope and put his hand on March's shoulder. I wanted the police to see this first. Jill flicked through the photos one by one, shaking her head. Renz kept quiet and gave his former colleagues some time to look through the photographs until Jill finally looked up and said, "Did you read the note?" His suspect pushed her down the stairs. That's what Taylor suspected. He wasn't certain. But the assault, and the way Taylor wrote that note, do indicate that he was convinced. You could say that he assumed it, but he couldn't prove anything. That explains why he kept this to himself for so long, Van Belzen understood. He saved it while he was collecting more information. He was still working on it. He kept it to himself for too long, Jill noted with frustration in her voice, until his death. March had been sliding back and forth on her chair for a while, visibly uncomfortable. She couldn't sit still any longer. Who? She asked, shocked by the loudness of her own voice. She had a quick look around to make sure she hadn't attracted the attention of any other customers. A bit softer, she asked, who was pushed down the stairs? Renz picked up the picture that lay upside down on the table and showed it to her. She was, if I'm not mistaken, Mrs. Monroe, who was buried 6 weeks ago. My successor's wife. Van Belzen's reaction was undeniable. His cheeks flushed with excitement, and he started to sweat. You were right. There's no doubt. Just as you said her name, I saw it. I never saw her that often, but that is definitely Monroe's wife. Monroe's late wife. It took the colleagues 3/4 of an hour to make sense of it all. Monroe, their trusted colleague, had been abusing his wife a long time, Taylor's file revealed. All three of them realized that Monroe's wife had finally gone to the police to press charges. She'd gone to Taylor, as she couldn't go to her husband or his friend Van Stee. Taylor had likely confronted his boss Monroe, and this had been the content of the conversation Jill had overheard a few weeks before Taylor's death. We are at an impasse now, Jill quickly realized. Can we even take this to the chief of police? It's worse, Renz added. We have 2 cases now, instead of 1. Taylor's death, and the suspicious death of Monroe's wife. Or at least Monroe's assault. Van Belzen thought out loud, Monroe has had a short fuse for a long time. That's no secret, Van Stee probably knows about that as well. Taylor must have had the same dilemma. The pictures were proof of an assault, but he couldn't yet prove that Monroe had killed his wife. Taylor's notes indicate that Mrs. Monroe was scared for her life for a while, especially since another woman got involved. Renz remembered the black-haired woman he had met at Monroe's house. She had opened the door. He realized that she might not have been a neighbor. Maybe she was living with Monroe. Why hadn't he thought of that before? Yes, there was another woman, a woman with dark black hair. But that was not enough. Renz Fox did not want to jump to conclusions. Perhaps his wife's fall down the stairs really was an accident, as Monroe claims it was. Taylor couldn't prove that she had been pushed or thrown. I doubt we can prove that with even less information than Taylor had. Jill and Van Belzen could only agree. Showing the photographs to Van Stee would only inform the chief of alleged domestic abuse. Imagine if we said that Monroe was guilty of his wife's death, and Van Stee couldn't prove it. Monroe would stay in charge of the investigation into Taylor's death. The impact would be huge, the police corps would become unmanageable. That's why I asked you two to meet us here. Renz took a deep sigh and sounded worried. You must understand that it's nearly impossible for me to condemn Monroe, even though I'm sure that our dear colleague did poison Taylor. March smiled a little. Monroe is a murderer. I have no doubt. Renz couldn't have said that any more fiercely. You sound like you saw him do it. Not exactly, Renz admitted, but Taylor told us. Renz reached for his mobile phone in his pocket. Take a look at this picture. Van Belzen squeezed his eyelids even more than he normally did behind his glasses. What's that? You're not blind, are you, Van Belzen? Jill said, it's Taylor. Dead, with his arms spread over the table. Gosh, yes, I see. Where did you get these? Jill took pictures for me that Friday evening. But that's beside the point. Don't you see the vital piece of information here? Jill replied, Taylor is pointing his fork at Hendricks and Van Stee's wife, Nancy. What does that have to do with any of this? Renz scribbled his ear. That's what I thought at first, but look again. He's also pointing at the man in the middle, who we never paid attention to because he's an inspector. Van Belzen tried to see the direction of the fork more clearly by almost pressing the phone against his eyes. Jill looked at Renz. She clearly understood what he meant. Who is it between Ster Hendricks and Nancy Van Stee? Van Belzen asked. Inspector Monroe, Renz replied. Renz Fox did not have to explain the meaning of Taylor's gesture to Jill. With completely undisguised enthusiasm, she concluded that Taylor had pointed at his murderer as a final effort while he was dying. Taylor must have anticipated this investigation, or at least the possible culprit. He seized the last few seconds of his life to accuse Monroe. There is more, March said. Yes, there is, her husband confirmed. Hopeful eyes were gazing at him from all directions. You remember Taylor's last words, don't you? Jill nodded. Van Belzen replied, help, Monroe. Everyone misinterpreted his words. Jill immediately understood, he did not mean to ask for Monroe's help. Taylor didn't want Monroe to lead the investigation. He meant to say something along the lines of help, Monroe wants to kill me. Jill, Van Belzen, and March became increasingly convinced that the retired Inspector Renz Fox was right. Jill understood when Renz reminded her how Monroe had done his best to keep him away from the scene and the investigation afterward. He pushed you aside, Jill remembered. I thought he didn't want you around because he's your successor, but he must have been worried that you'd get involved and unravel all this. Van Belzen straightened his heavy glasses by pushing 2 fingers up against his plump cheeks on which the frame rested. Short white spots appeared where his fingers had pushed. He has outright forbidden us to share any information with you, he said. It seemed logical to me at the time, but from this new point of view, I would say it's suspicious. He wanted to keep this investigation safe to cover up his own deeds. Monroe needed someone else to blame. The easiest way was to lead the investigation himself. The 3 at the table found more and more clues. Monroe practically muddled the crime scene and didn't take any action to capture the first crucial clues when Taylor was dying. He had been stretching time to make sure Taylor would be dead before the ambulance arrived. He had been trying to convince everyone that Taylor had just become unwell. When did you start to suspect Monroe? March asked when they drove back to Zeeland after their meeting in De Guier. He acted suspiciously from the very first moment. I thought he had something to hide from the moment he pushed me aside. After the funeral, I couldn't get it out of my mind. Monroe was way too eager to blame Wendy. So you went to visit him. You told him that you knew his wife from school. That was an excuse. I had never seen that woman before, which is why I wasn't sure about the photographs. Monroe got angry when I visited him. That also made me think. Why? Why would someone who recently lost his wife get angry if someone comes to pay his respect? Will they have enough real evidence against Monroe? March wondered. That's a matter of time, I suppose. Renz sounded confident. Monroe must have hidden the poison in Wendy's house, after which he pretended to find it himself during the house search. They will find traces of cyanide potassium in his home. He won't be able to explain that. The car moved peacefully along the highway. Bob Dylan sang Forever Young. March looked aside and studied the man behind the steering wheel. "Congratulations, you stubborn darling," she said. "I'm glad you pushed through after all. Monroe won't get away with this, and Wendy will go free. You can truly retire now. This was your very last case."